Very, very excited to have an opportunity to speak to you today about the wonderful and evolving world of ransomware risk. This is a very topical issue. Obviously, we've seen, as was discussed in the introduction, huge explosion in ransom demands, a significant amount of complications in terms of the triage and also the key recovery steps that sit around it. You'll notice from the introduction that there was a whole host of different issues that we were looking to touch on for this presentation. When I was thinking about the best type of guidance and support that I could provide people today, I really wanted to focus not so much on some of the pure tech and ground up controls. I think we've got some specialist vendors such as Okta and otherwise who are very good people to talk to and discuss that. What I want to do is I want to, for the next 15, 20 minutes, talk about the key gaps that I see historically across the clients that I work with. And really, in my mind, that begins from the investigative process, the resilience process, and also how they try and coordinate and how they try and understand the challenges that are going to arise within their business and within the key stakeholders that they work with. So with that as a bit of a mud map, I'm just going to get into it. I'm going to start with a couple of high-level comments around where is the ransomware crisis now, what's going on. This won't be a surprise for many of the audience here. What I then want to do is I want to touch on the specific elements of the Australian perspective. I'm going to quickly talk about why, in my mind, ransomware events are so hard to navigate, why there's so much pressure and challenge associated with them, as opposed to other forms of cyber attack. We'll talk about the concept of being prepared. And then finally, I want to finish with just a few practical ideas and just some really easy low-hanging fruit that people can take away with them. So with that as a bit of a mud map, to start with the ransomware crisis, as was mentioned earlier, huge explosion in terms of the size and the scale and also the frequency of ransomware events. There's a whole bunch of different modeling reports out there, but many of them place the anticipated size of ransomware in terms of its economic impact at somewhere between 20 to 25 billion, occurring within currently, and also there's a whole bunch of views that the specific impacts are likely to double or triple in the next 5 years. We know that they happen very frequently. We know as well that there's a huge number of different variants that we're trying to deal with, and that the way in which ransom extortions are essentially forced through is very, very varied due to a lot more attacker creativity. I've mentioned here issues around social engineering, some of the challenges that sit around sensitive data records, the way in which we're trying to think about the way in which customers and stakeholders can be impacted. Two other things I'll just quickly mention here is that while we talk a lot about ransomware and the decision to pay or not to pay and the decision to restore, what's commonly not understood is between 80 to 95% of all ransomware attacks are estimated now to involve some type of form of data exfiltration. That's really important because as soon as we have data exfiltration, we have privacy liabilities. We also have exposures in relation to the way in which you may have to think about other types of regulators that you've got to deal with, and also what we try and think about in terms of the reputational harm elements. Finally, we've just got some high-level details of recent ransoms. In some ways, the examples we've given are probably understated. There's been some this year, particularly in Europe, where the information is that the ransom demands have been above 100 million USD equivalent. So huge scale of the problem and huge cost that sits around with it. For the Australian perspective, a lot of this reflects global, but the bits that I'm going to focus on is we do know now that ransom demands in Australia regularly are between 2 to 8 million. I'm aware of a number in the last 6 months that have been at the $20 and $30 million mark. So it's not just a foreign problem, it has landed here, and the costs and expenses of dealing with them are very, very significant. We also know that huge amounts of losses actually sit off the back of ransoms. So we do a lot of work, as we mentioned, in the insurance industry. Most insurers attribute between 80 to 90% of all of their cyber losses to ransomware events. When you think about that as a proportion of the risk and exposure that you're facing as a business, whether you have insurance or not, that does tell you that this is pretty much top of the chain in terms of the costs, the expenses, and the ultimate difficulty for the business as an ongoing concern where these occur. I've talked a little bit about policy impacts. It was mentioned in the introduction that there's live movement here in the Australian space. So we did have the ransomware plan that was announced by the federal government last year. Off the back of that, they want to introduce a mandatory regime for the reporting of ransomware incidents, but also issues in relation to payment of ransomware and so forth. And last thing, there is a huge amount of creativity that we also see in the local market in terms of the way in which ransomware groups look to prosecute and also the way in which ransomware groups try and use leverage to make you pay. This slide here is really just to give a high-level idea of what does it mean for me when I sit within the organizational bubble and I try to understand what is the problem that we're dealing with and what is the reason why it's so much harder. I've broken it down to 7 discrete issues that I think commonly come up with ransoms. So firstly, when we have cyber extortion attacks, there are significant accountability and responsibility challenges that the audience and that the organization has to go through. There's commercial risks, there's reputational risks, there's functional risks. There's also a whole host of different types of stakeholder dilemmas. Because of this, confusion often arises around who has authority for different parts of the response. How does the IT team think about where and when it needs to bring in other help from the different parts of the business? And how do we ultimately decide when we've got to make key decisions about taking systems offline, causing bits of BI, dealing with a malicious actor? Where does that going to vest within the organization? Is it going to be internal? Is it going to be vendor-led? I've talked as well about the cross-functional organizational pressures and really what we see with ransomware events more than anything else. You have very active and live discussions very early on between people that sit across IT, risk, legal, operations, HR, communications, senior management. And so we're actually testing incident response and crisis response in a way that we don't traditionally test across the cyberspace. Normally it's very much the IT or the InfoSec vertical runs with it. And then there's just some small elements of reporting. That doesn't work with ransoms. We've really got to be thinking about all of the challenges and all of the issues very quickly. I talked about the scale of financial risks here. As I've mentioned, ransoms cost a lot. Data restoration and systems recovery is incredibly expensive at the moment, and the trend lines are that it's actually going up. We also have rising privacy exposures, and we also have a lot of other challenges that the business needs to think about, because particularly if you're in a manufacturing vertical, an OT vertical, some type of vertical where availability has an immediate impact on financial outcome, you can get huge BI losses that stagger off the back of ransomware events. Legal and regulatory, obviously the complexity is growing there. You already have between, for most industries, 2 to 6 regulators that you might be engaged with or that you might need to contact because of a major ransom event. We've got the critical infrastructure laws, which are adding another layer to that. We've also got the fact that the ransomware reporting regime is coming in. Most organizations hold global data, so it's not just Australian laws, but it's other laws protecting data subjects that you need to think about. And then we've also got the sanctions and the anti-terrorism finance laws, more for multinationals, but that OFAC checking process is much more involved and much more difficult than it's historically been. On the contractual environment, we see a lot more examples of where if you have a ransomware event, it's going to trigger a whole bunch of different contractual obligations. That may be whether or not you comply with minimum security standards. It may be pure aspects of reporting. It could do with testing. It could do with issues around how you were storing the data, and also issues around the types of insurance that you were holding, if you had sufficient insurance, and what that meant in terms of the way in which you responded and whether that was appropriate. The last two that I'll quickly cover, I think ransomware events really hit what are traditional gaps in how the way most organizations develop their incident response and their business continuity plans. Reason for this is because you need a really clear decision tree. Often we're quite bad at that in this region. Also, we've got to think about specific ransomware work streams. So due diligence regarding malicious actor, payment methodologies, how we facilitate the payment decryption works, way in which we're going to look to bring in vendors, and also some of the ways in which we think about the coordination across CMT, so where various roles and responsibility will sit. The final thing I'll mention here is that incident response is clearly more complex when you're dealing with a ransomware event. There's a much wider set of expert support vendors that you often need. That may include a ransomware negotiator. It may be different forensic investigators. It may be people that help with payment. Could also be people that help with the decryption validation, or some of the wider legal and reputational issues that can come up. So if I take a step back and if I think about I'm sitting within the organization, what would I be looking to do? As I've mentioned, there's a separate control piece. That's a discussion that can go on for hours. But I do think that there's a separate challenge that organizations also have to do, which is so much of the way in which we approach cyber is compliance driven. It's quite box checky. It's very much about kind of frameworks and benchmarking. I don't think any of that works for ransomware. Ransomware's got to be underpinned by something that's strategic. If you want to actually respond to a risk that's dynamic and also that can have these impacts, we've got to really start with things like situational awareness, your key exposures, how you as an organization think that you'd ideally navigate through a critical event like this. So I've talked about some of the things that I think you should add in, elements of education. We do a lot of generic privacy education, sometimes legal and regulatory, but I think it's really important to educate. This is what a catastrophic cyber event looks like for your C-suite, for your management. These are the things you want to have in mind. This is how you're going to navigate. I also think the way in which we coordinate, how we look at specific elements of resilience, whether that's the backup, whether that's the actual processes that we go through for triage. So I've called out 5 things that I would incorporate in all of the discussions that I was having internally. Firstly, on the education bit, I think you've got to let people know this is the flavour of what a ransomware event looks like. These are the dilemmas, these are the crisis points. I do think stakeholder engagement is absolutely critical. Last thing that you want to do is have a live ransomware event where you have differing views across the business of how certain elements of the response and the triage should go. I think you should try to reach consensus. I think you should give your key management and your key CMT and IR people the chance to really think through how are we going to deal with this as a whole, and also to try and have some consensus, whether that's written in policies or processes is different, but have a general understanding across the business of this is the path forward, these are the key things we're focused on. I've mentioned the challenge with incident response vendors. Also, support needs tend to be quite different for an organization when they're dealing with a ransomware event. So what are going to be the types of tools and processes that you're going to need for onboarding? When you bring those vendors in, how are they going to do the best job? Have we got the right asset identifications? Can we actually provide them with sufficient network information for them to be able to do the investigations? How are we thinking about the key supports that the internal InfoSec and IT teams need, because they're in a crisis environment and they're under a huge amount of stress. Improving resilience is a discussion that can go on for a long time. Two bits I want to really focus on is that I think that resilience is a practice state. So you have to be familiar with this is what the event looks like, but also this is how we'd run through it. There's a lot of talk about cyber incident tabletops. I'm a huge advocate for them. We run a number of them, and I haven't ever run or been involved in one where the client and the organization hasn't taken a huge amount of benefit. Even if you don't want to incur the cost, then you can run a number of these exercises on a small scale internally. Last thing I'll mention is that there is a lot of focus on the investigation process and also how we're doing data preservation and log preservation. This is going to be a really big challenge the next few years because regulators are hot to trot on this. The way in which we identify how we understood the data subjects that were impacted, the data assets, the way in which we looked at the triage, they'll influence privacy, they'll influence risk of harm, they'll influence all of the regulatory issues coming in relation to reasonable steps and processes about both InfoSec and also our response. And I'll leave you with one thing in that if you look at what the regulators like ASIC have really done, what they're focusing on is they're focusing on instances where an organization has had a cyber event and they haven't responded effectively. The reason for that is because I think that's a much easier case to prove regulatory liability on, because you've got a set proven state of where you were and you can say, well, this is best practice for the IR response. So again, those are the things that I'd be focusing on. There are some really low-hanging fruit. Most organizations have some form of cyber insurance at the moment. It's quite foolish if you're not embedding this into your wider incident response and crisis management processes. Obviously, there are separate notification channels. If you want to get the support from the insurer, use their vendors. They can assist you with vendor support. They've got good ideas of how investigation and notification should go. And you'll see here that the timelines are they should move relatively quickly. You can encourage them to move quickly if you've actually done the onboarding and the basic work. I've also talked about some of the ransomware incident work streams. This is always different for each type of organization, and it's really about your profile, where you sit, the key risks, the key exposures that you have. But there are some common threads. So for a lot of organizations, there are some common points of how they think about whether they should pay a ransom, also how they think about whether they should assess the benefits, and the way in which they should assess dealing with a malicious actor. Privacy and reporting obligations, they're becoming much more standard. So I think you can really have a good sketch of what that looks like. How we want to think about expected recovery times for ransoms, that's pretty key because that'll influence elements of the comm strategy. It'll influence elements of the coordination strategy, the vendor responses and the work streams. And finally, I do think we've got to have front and center how we're going to communicate with third parties, key stakeholders, and also internal employees. Malicious actors are now very, very good at being very public, where and when they've actually succeeded in these events. And we also find there's a large amount of leakage through people involved. So the organization doesn't have the same level of control over keeping these things in-house as what they would have historically. The last thing I'm going to leave you with on the low-hanging fruit is really just some key things for you to think about internally within your teams, both on InfoSec, but the people that will do incident response and crisis management. First thing I'll say is you've got to accept whenever we're dealing with ransomware, you're in a state of imperfect information. There's a lot of things you don't know factually. There's a lot of legal risks that aren't clear. So we're talking about reasonable determinations, and sometimes that is just the only bar that you can hang your decision on and what you go through. So you've got to be a little bit comfortable living in that situation where there isn't always 100% certainty. I do think whoever you're going to put on the crisis management team in that process, it needs to have a lot of cross-functional expertise, including business, including risk, including leadership, including the IT and that control speciality. I've mentioned here that as you go through these processes, there are always a whole bunch of different priorities that you've got to navigate and juggle. So you have to be flexible. You have to let different people within the team and different vendors that you work with delegate and take the running on certain things. Vendor onboarding is incredibly powerful. Last thing you want to do is decide that you need a key provider to go through a ransomware response and not have processes agreed around contractual, your own internal requirements, and have that being a delay of a couple of days. I've talked about accountability before, accountability in decision trees. If no one knows who's taking the lead on different things, you've got to try and do it on the fly, and that's always quite uncomfortable. Also, the fact that you can look at identifying a lot of these immediate actions and you can pre-plan them in your processes and your playbooks. Finally, there's a lot of talk at the moment around how organizations develop this unifying response for ransomware events. I think there's a good idea to that. How you document that, and if you want to document that, is a separate issue. But you should be having those discussions. You should work out where there are going to be points of tension and points of difference. And where that's the case, you might not come to a landing. It is a difficult process, but at least starting on that journey has a number of benefits. So those were the key messages that I wanted to get across. I think the last thing that I'll just say is keep the context. They are a form of cyber event. They're a very difficult form of cyber event, but we've been managing them across the industry for 10, 15 years. If you just take a step back, if you just go from a first principles perspective, I think they are manageable. And I think for most organizations, they will be able to get the right outcomes. That was everything from me. Thank you.